What would you do if a very close friend or family member came to you and said, if you don't borrow me $6,000, I am going to lose my house in foreclosure? Would you do it? Would you give them the money, save your friend, save your family, or you throw them out to the wolves? Unfortunately, this is a situation that too many people are faced with. They get pressured from a friend or family member into borrowing them money that oftentimes maybe they don't even really have. But the sob story is so terrible that they just can't bear to see their friend or family suffer. And of course, they give in and give them the money. And as a quick reminder, I have a lot of different things to talk about in this video, especially real estate related. So make sure you guys check the timestamps for different stories that you might be interested so you don't miss it. Well, this exact situation that I just brought up was in one of these recent help articles, and basically their friend is asking them for $5,800 in order to pay his mortgage. Otherwise, that's it. He's losing it to foreclosure. And he says, I was thinking about loaning him the money because he's been a good friend of mine and I hate to see him lose his home as he has no savings. But just right off the bat, something I want to point out from that very first paragraph is that he's a good friend of mine. I hate to see him lose his home, so lots of sympathy, but he has no savings. So it's one of those situations like, can you really afford to be a homeowner if you don't have any savings? You know, that's the first thing you got to look at. Now, they did say that he recently went through a divorce, which obviously can be very financially taxing for people. So we're not going to get into that aspect of it, but it's important to know that at least that is something that happened, which is going to be a detriment to someone's finances. But right away, the next question is, if I loan this person the money, would I be able to place a lien against his property if it still has his wife's name on it? Also, he said that he previously loaned a friend $7,000 and she later died. What would be my recourse if this friend failed to pay back the loan or if he died? And the answer I really like, because this sounds like the way I would answer this. The first thing that this person says, the expert says, you are looking for trouble. Loaning money to friends and wondering whether a $5,000 loan would enable you to put a lien on a friend's house to get your money back and lost $7,000 on another friend who passed away. This is the wake-up call that life is hard for everybody, okay? Bad things happen to people. People get into debt. People pass away unexpectedly. There's taxes. There's job losses. There's divorce. Things happen. And everybody's going to go through some of these trials and tribulations in their life. And the thing is, it's not up to you to be everybody's savior and superhero to come to their rescue the moment they run into trouble, especially if it's money that you can't afford to lose. Now, it's one thing if you're wealthy and your friend asks you for $6,000, that's a drop in the bucket. Of course, it's not really going to break your bank then, and then you can just make a simple decision. Do you want to give this person the money or not? It doesn't even have to be a loan. It can just be a gift and say, here you go, buddy, you know, don't lose your house. But a lot of people don't have that kind of cash just laying around. But here's the problem that the expert says, and also I agree with this sentiment, saying that, you know, if you loan the friend the $6,000, this isn't going to be the end of this person's financial problems, because just look at the situation, right? They need this $6,000 or they're going to lose their house and they have no savings. So how did you end up there, right? Besides the divorce, there must have been a lot of other poor financial decisions made, because even if you went through a divorce, but if you were doing everything right financially, you're not going to end up broke. You're going to have money still. You're just only going to have half of it probably, but you're still going to have something. But having half of nothing means that you had nothing before the divorce. And also, the other thing that's talked about here is that if you're already worried about having to put a lien on their home because you're worried if they don't pay you back, then how close of friends are you really? You know, how much do you really trust this person if you think that you're going to need to put a lien on their house? The expert says exactly what I just said a little bit ago. Like, yeah, if you want to give them the money, then give them the money basically as a gift. Don't expect them to pay it back. You're basically going to give them the money and don't ever plan on seeing that money ever again. That's the attitude and mentality you have to take if you're going to take on this responsibility. In fact, there's actually some data that proves this and backs up what I just said. About 2/3 of people who have loaned money say it was never returned, according to a study of 3,000 adults by Coupon Code. People were owed on average about $522 and they weren't paid back. So people aren't paying back $500 loans. You think they're paying back $6,000 loans? Like I said, plan on giving it as a gift. And according to the data, actually, your ex-partner is most likely to come to you and ask you for a loan. And then 60% of people who borrowed money from friends said they do so a couple of times a year, and 27% say they ask for loans almost every single month. Can you imagine having a friend like that? I would be dropping that person. They would be gone from my life. I'm sorry, you're out. I am not the bank. And clearly, if you have a friend like that, that's how they view you. Whether you want to see that or admit it or not is one thing, but that's the truth, guys. If people are tapping you every single month on the shoulder, asking you for a loan because they're behind, why do you think they're your friend? And you got to question, are they really your friend? Or do you just think that they are your friend? Are they disguised as a friend? And then as far as losing the money and putting a lien, forget about stuff like that, okay? You're not going to put a lien on your friend's house because that's just going to cause even more trouble and tension, and you're not even going to be friends anymore probably after that. But the thing is, when most lenders have a loan that goes bad, they're able to write off the debt. But if you're giving like a personal loan to somebody, if you have it notarized and everything's documented, the IRS will allow you to take up to a $3,000 capital loss each year for something like that. If you were to loan your friend the money, then at least $3,000 of that $6,000 would be a write-off against your taxes if everything's documented properly. So I guess maybe that helps a little bit. But in my opinion, the whole point is that it shouldn't even come down to this. You shouldn't even be in this situation. So I got to side with the expert here that if you're going to give the loan, consider it a gift, not a loan. Otherwise, I would just say no. You know, it sucks to not be able to help your friend, but you have to look out for your own personal finances before bailing somebody else out of theirs, guys. And this is something often too many parents fall into as well. I talked about that about a month ago in a video. You know, you have so many parents paying their kids' bills still, and they're in their mid-20s or 30s living at home. Like, you cannot solve people's financial problems for them. They need to learn on their own how to get by and how to make it. Now, one thing we haven't talked about in a while is evictions, but this is a different take on evictions and something a little bit different to talk about here. Right now, there are tenants who are being charged eviction fees even if they aren't actually evicted. When I first read this, I was like, what? What does that even mean? But once you hear about this might sound familiar, and you may have gone through something like this as well. Obviously, we know there's a lot of big corporate landlords right now, and sometimes they can be great and sometimes they can be the worst. Here's a story of a woman back in September of 2023 in Jacksonville, Florida. She was behind on her rent and facing possible eviction. She had already accrued $370 in fees, including late charges, when the property manager, Progress Residential, added 2 new charges the day before Thanksgiving. One was a $200 eviction admin fee. The other was an $827 attorney filing fee. And afraid that she was going to be evicted, she came up with the money and sent a check for the full balance on her account, including the eviction-related fees, within just a couple days. But a few days later, she received an email from Progress Residential that said, due to your prompt payment, the eviction proceedings have been officially dismissed. But in reality, there was nothing to dismiss because the landlord never actually filed for eviction. Because apparently the only way it's legal for these property managers and landlords to collect these fees is if a judge orders them to be collected with an eviction order. So this woman paid a little over $1,000 in fees to the property manager, and she decided to sue. Her lawsuit actually got dropped though, and combined with another lawsuit against the same landlord for a similar situation in Orlando. The management company's attorneys said that these fees were allowed under the tenant's leases, and the company was entitled to them because the tenants fell behind on rent, which breached the contract. And managers and landlords are entitled to recover costs of an eviction, providing there is actually an eviction order. And that's where these guys got in trouble, because they never actually filed for eviction. They never went before a judge, and the judge never ordered this person to be evicted and gave a judgment order against them. So just like the other day, I mentioned this story about the guy using ChatGPT to comb through his HOA documents to prove them wrong. Well, you could do the same thing with your lease here, guys. You could put your lease into ChatGPT, put in there and say something like, you know, find all of the extra fees that I could be charged in this lease, and it can easily outline them for you, and you can understand what you're signing and what you're getting yourself into before you do it. Because another thing that these guys are doing is they are banking on fear, right? They send somebody an eviction notice and they say you must pay all this up or get out, which is called a 3-day notice here in Florida. And tenants do have to pay the rent that's not paid. This doesn't apply to unpaid rent, but what we're talking about here is extra fees that they're tacking on in addition to the unpaid rent. And so these guys are not really allowed to collect those fees, even though you signed the lease saying that they would be able to collect them unless you actually get evicted. So it's something for people to keep in mind. And I'm not a lawyer, this is not legal advice. I'm just going by what I read here in this story and how this has worked out in court so far for some people. A similar court case happened in 2017 in Baltimore with Westminster Management, and they hit their residents with agent fees and legal costs before eviction cases were resolved or even filed, very similar to this. And of course, they argued the same thing, that they're entitled to these fees according to the lease. And this case actually ended up in the Supreme Court, where they issued an opinion last year that landlords cannot recover costs other than rent and some late fees in an eviction proceeding without a judge's order. So that's pretty clear. You're only entitled to rent and late fees, not any of the other extra stuff that they put in there. Admin fees, attorney fees, and all of this, unless they get the judgment order. So essentially, these landlords, especially the big corporate ones, can put whatever they want in their leases, but it doesn't mean that it's legal or that it's going to hold up in court. But they're betting on the fact that, like this woman from Florida, they'll send you the letter and make people scared that they're going to be evicted and have them just pay up the back paid rent, the late fees, and the extra additional fees that they tack on just so you don't get kicked out. You know, they essentially use fear to make people pay. So like, how many of people out there have paid these fees fraudulently? Essentially, they were not supposed to pay, but they were worried about being evicted, so they paid it anyways. But the truth is, I don't know how this works in every state, but as somebody who's had to go through an eviction process myself as a landlord, you don't actually have to pay anything until you officially get evicted. Until there is a judgment order against you, then you will have to pay. And also, that's when the sheriff will remove you and your belongings from the property here in Florida. And like I've told people many times in the past, this is really not something you want on your record, because if you do end up getting evicted, it is going to make it near impossible to rent another place afterwards, guys. So this is your last step before becoming homeless or moving in with a friend or family member. You really don't want an eviction on your record ever. But when you get that 3-day notice on your door saying pay up or quit, which basically means you need to pay everything you owe or get out, that is like your grace period and your warning that you can either pay the rent that you owe me right now plus the late fees and you can stay, or if you don't, then get out. And if you don't do either one of those things within the 3-day notice, then the landlord can file for eviction and take you to court and get you actually removed from the property with a judgment order to pay all of the fees, including maybe attorney fees or anything else involved with the case. Which is yet another reason why you don't want this to happen, because if you get a judgment order against you and say you don't pay, then your wages can be garnished, you know? So one way or another, you're gonna end up on the hook for this. Now, earlier this week, there was an update about the property tax reform here in Florida. And there's a lot of interesting ideas being discussed in Florida Congress surrounding this issue, which I wanna bring a few of them up right here. One of them is that they're going to maybe require every city and county and special district to hold a referendum on the elimination of homestead property taxes. And this would allow taxpayers and taxing authorities to have an open and honest conversation about what their services are, what people are receiving for their taxes, and whether they wish to continue to pay those taxes. Man, do I love that idea. The next thing they're looking at doing, which I think would be fantastic, at least for most Floridians, is that they are looking at creating a new $500,000 homestead tax exemption for non-school property taxes. So that's the part I don't like about it. I like the $500,000 exemption, but the fact that it doesn't apply to the school taxes is a huge buzzkill, because that's literally where half, if not more than half, of your property taxes go to. So if it doesn't help put a ding on that, and they're the most responsible for raising your property taxes every year, it is going to help lower your taxes, but not by as much as you think. Because say you could buy a house in Florida for $400,000 and you have that homestead property tax exemption of $500,000, that means you wouldn't owe any taxes to your local city, state, or county, whatever, but you would still have to pay the full amount of the school taxes. So I think they should just eliminate that too. And they're even talking about increasing that limit to $1 million for people who are over 65 years old. So there's something to consider as well. But that would only apply if you've had a homestead at the same property for over 30 years here in Florida. But I don't want to complain too much, because these are all ideas to lower taxes, not increase them. So even if it's not a complete elimination, it's much better than major increases like we typically see. Another thing they're looking at doing is enhancing Florida's assessment limitation caps for homestead and non-homesteaded properties. Like, for example, right now, if you have a homestead, they can raise your assessed value by a maximum of 3% per year. If you don't have a homestead, they can raise it by a maximum of 10% per year. So what they would be looking at doing instead is extending out these timelines to where they would only be able to raise your assessed value on your homesteaded property by 3% every 3 years. And if you have a non-homesteaded property, then they would only be able to raise it by 15% every 3 years, which means a maximum of only 5% per year now, which cuts that in half. So even people who don't have homesteaded properties here in Florida would get a pretty big break on how much their taxes can go up every year. And this would definitely provide more stability when it comes to people's tax bill and their tax payments. Like, this is the #1 thing that's driving people out of their homes in Florida, on top of the homeowner's insurance, guys. It is just too expensive for most people to be floating this right now. And this other measure that they're considering is also pretty great. They're looking at prohibiting the government from foreclosing on a homestead property for unpaid taxes. So this would essentially put the government on the same footing as private sector creditors and ensure the government cannot kick out any Floridian of their home due to their inability to pay a tax. Now, none of this stuff that I talked about is set in stone, but they're all things that are up for discussion right now that could end up being implemented and could end up on the voting ballot in November of 2026. And it sucks that we have to wait this long, you know, like, the only good thing right now, the only thing that's working in all of our favor if you live in Florida, they should be coming down for everybody this year, because home values are going down. So if you see your tax bill go up this year, you definitely need to be fighting that, guys. And like I said, I always have a link for Ownwell down in the description, so anybody who needs to sign up for that to fight property taxes on your behalf, make sure you sign up for that. But you know, going back to the beginning of this video, I just want to say that life is hard for a lot of people right now. And chances are it's probably hard for you too. And if it's not, then that's wonderful. That means you've made a lot of right decisions for your life, and you've done everything right for the most part, and you deserve to enjoy that success. But nobody should be letting somebody else bring them down or destroy that success because they didn't make the proper financial decisions themselves. And that might sound kind of selfish, but I don't think so. Because everybody has to work extremely hard to get to a good place where they're financially secure in life. And the last thing you want is somebody who is irresponsible dragging you down with them. People need to use their own judgment call on stuff like that. You know who's responsible. You know who's likely to pay you back and who's not. You know the people you hang around with, guys. So really, if you make a bad judgment call, it's going to be on you. Me personally, I probably wouldn't loan anybody money. If I did give anybody money, it would just be a gift, just like I said. If it's something I feel like I can afford and something that I know could really help somebody out that I truly care for, then yeah, that would be it. But I would always be keeping the back of my mind, like, this isn't gonna fix their problems forever. And if it's somebody who I know is always irresponsible with money, I wouldn't give it to them, because they need to now learn the hard way on how to fix that, guys. If people are always bailing you out, you're never going to know how to handle your finances. You're never going to know how to completely get by without asking other people for help all the time. So unfortunately, sometimes people just need to learn these lessons the hard way. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.